Hi everyone, welcome to another video. In this video we're going to compare these two cameras, the Sony A9 III and the Sony A1. And we're going to talk about which one might be a better choice for bird photography. First things first, this video is not sponsored by anyone, so it's entirely my own opinion. Let's first start talking about the ergonomics and controls and the handling of the cameras. The A9 III is newer camera, so it has a number of improvements over the A1. Namely, the grip is a little bit better sculpted. It feels a little deeper and just feels better to hold. So when you're hand holding a long lens like the 600 f4, 300 2.8 and all that, it feels a little bit better. The buttons on the A9 III are a little bit larger, and they're also raised. So if you look at the C1, C2 buttons on the A9 III, they're raised up higher and they have a little base, so it's a little easier to press them when you're hand holding a long lens. And the rest of the cameras, the two cameras, is very similar. There aren't that many major differences in terms of size, weight. They're about the same size and weight. This one here looks a little bit taller because I have a base plate on it, and it also has a larger lens. On the back side, the LCD screens are similar. They're similar in size and resolution. The Sony rear screens are actually a little bit lower resolution than the competition. I was hoping that they would switch to a newer, higher resolution, maybe OLED screen, but they did not. It's the same as the A1. And one advantage that the A9 III has is that the LCD has more articulation compared to the A1. The A1 basically can just come out like this, up or down, but it doesn't swing out, in or out like that. But the A9 III is the newer one, so it can do this. It can basically rotate and then do all kinds of articulation. So you can combine the tilt with the swivel function and then basically use it at different angles. So this may have some advantage when you're shooting low to the ground for some low angle shots and things like that. So it's a welcome change, but it's not a huge difference for shooting birds because you're typically looking through the viewfinder. You're not going to use the rear LCD for framing or anything like that most of the time. Let's talk about the viewfinders. The viewfinders of these cameras are virtually identical as well. They both use the same micro OLED panel. It's about 9-point-something million dots, or 2500 pixels wide, in the high quality mode. So both have three modes. They have basically the normal or low refresh rate mode that operates at 60 Hertz but is at full resolution. It has a 120 Hertz mode, which is lower resolution, and then it has a 240 Hertz or high plus mode, which basically uses a cropped area of the viewfinder panel. So you only get about 1600 pixels, and so the image becomes smaller, but it refreshes at 240 Hertz. And this mode is the one you want to use for birds in flight, panning at long focal lengths like 600 millimeter, 840, 1200 millimeter, even I would say 400 or 300 millimeters. You want to be at 240 Hertz when you're panning, otherwise you're going to have lag and the image is going to look a little choppy. So in that regard, they're similar and there's no difference. I hope that at some point we can get the full resolution at 240 Hertz. And the other thing that you should know about these cameras is that in continuous focus mode, once you engage the focus tracking, there's a little bit of drop in the resolution that's noticeable in the 60 Hertz and 120 Hertz modes. When you half press the shutter speed, the shutter button, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of aliasing and moire in the viewfinder. That's because the resolution actually drops. And this is something that I also hope the Sony addresses going forward. But right now it's one of the best in the business for bird photography in terms of refresh rate and the overall viewfinder size and resolution. Now, what is the main advantage of A9 III over A1 is basically the continuous shooting speed. The A1 can shoot up to 30 frames a second at full resolution. The A9 III can shoot up to 120 frames a second at full resolution. And 120 frames a second is incredibly fast. Basically, it is so fast that if you start playing with it, you just press the shutter for a little bit and then you have hundreds of frames. And the other feature that it has that I find very useful is that it has the pre-capture buffer. The pre-capture buffer basically starts buffering images as soon as you have pressed the shutter, and you can specify which amount of time it starts to buffer. For example, 0.3 seconds, half a second, up to 1 second before you actually fully press the shutter. The camera has been buffering as soon as you started half pressing. So you get these basically pre-full press shots. It's useful for conditions where you're focused on a perch and something is about to take off and you don't know exactly when. And then human reaction is most of the time not as fast as a bird. So once you press the shutter, it's possible that the bird's already halfway out of the perch. So this one will capture the frames before, which is useful. In practice, when I was trying this for flight shots, I didn't see that much of a benefit there, because for flight shots, initially you have to aim and start panning, and that's where the initial delay comes from. And as soon as the bird is focused on the as soon as the camera is focused on the bird, both of them will start shooting. So in those situations, I wouldn't say the pre-capture really helps you for flight, but for kind of setup shots, perch shots, something taking off, it's helpful for those conditions. And just let's talk about 120 frames a second for a little bit. So I tried this on multiple subjects, some raptors, some shorebirds, and some very fast birds like swallows and songbirds and things like that. And for most birds, I would say, especially larger birds like typical raptors, shorebirds, 120 frames a second is not really needed. Like, you get a lot of redundant frames, and in those cases I find that 30 frames a second is plenty. And in some cases there are some conditions where 120 frames a second may get you like a marginally better frame or something like that, but it's very, very rare. So in those cases, I wouldn't say that I would be shooting 120 frames a second. One thing to keep in mind when shooting 120 frames a second is that the buffer runs out real fast. I have the fastest CF Express cards on this, but still, because 1 second you have 120 frames, so you can think about like 2 seconds you already have 250 frames. So the buffer runs out in like most of the time, with the pre-capture also active, runs out in about less than 2 seconds. So you have to be careful and time things, because if you're shooting like peak of action after action after action, you might get a good sequence from the first phase, but the second phase the buffer is full and the speed is going to drop and all that. So you have to be careful with that. For that reason, I wouldn't set it to 120 frames a second all the time. As I said, it's mostly overkill for most of the subjects. So it has a setting where you can set the maximum shooting speed to maybe 30 frames a second, just like the A1. And then you can program one of these buttons. When you press it, it will just activate the 120 frames a second. So you get that incredibly fast continuous shooting when you feel like something might happen, like some kind of interaction or something that might happen, that you may take advantage of that. So overall, it's a good thing, but I wouldn't say it's really a deal breaker for most of the subjects, like shooting 120 versus 30. You won't get that many more keepers from typical subjects. Now, going to some specialized subjects, very, very specialized cases, like you have a setup for a kingfisher to dive under the water or something like that. So it has to be some kind of setup where every act is planned, and you know exactly when to engage that 120 frames a second. In those cases, you can end up with some frames that only this camera can take. And basically for those situations, it could be a very useful tool. The other case where I kind of used 120 frames a second and I felt like it was advantageous, it was for shooting swallows, because they're incredibly fast, and if you want to capture the best wing position, having that 120 frames a second really helps in that situation. But overall, in terms of speed, do I think 120 frames a second is needed for bird photography, bird in flight? No, I don't think so. Is it helpful in certain situations? Absolutely, it's helpful in certain situations to have, but for kind of general bird photography, I wouldn't say it's needed, especially for kind of like medium to large size raptors that I like to shoot, like osprey, eagle, even some like peregrine falcon. I wouldn't say you really need 120 frames a second. And you also have to be careful with downloading and post-processing and all that, because it generates a lot of files, and you gotta really be good in calling your images and basically sorting them real quick. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with thousands and thousands of images, and basically it will be a headache storing them and all of that stuff. Let's now talk about the autofocus and the differences between the autofocus system in A9 III and A1. A9 III is again the newer camera, so it has more autofocus features. Namely, it can recognize more types of subjects. The AI engine has been trained to distinguish more categories of subjects. For example, it has human, bird, animal, insect, terrain, plane, that kind of stuff, versus the A1 only has human, bird, and animal. And then with the A9 III, for each of those subjects, you can choose, when it detects that type of subject, for example a bird, which part it prioritizes to try to focus on, whether it's the eye or the head or the body. It has that distinction too, that setting too, which the A1 doesn't have. A1, when you say bird eye, it will just basically try to find the bird eye, and if it doesn't find the bird eye, or it can't discern the bird eye, it will basically revert to normal focus and just focus on the subject for you. So this one has more settings. The other difference that I noticed is that it has more focus patterns. It has a customizable focus pattern where you can basically choose the height and the width of the focus pattern. With this one, it only has a set of predetermined focus patterns that you can choose from. In terms of the fundamentals of the autofocus system, is very similar between the two. They both have non-tracking versus tracking mode. It's a little bit of a deceptive name, non-tracking versus tracking. Both of them, the focus is tracking the subject. But one of them, basically the camera, the non-tracking mode, basically looks into the focus pattern and tries to focus on what it thinks is the subject on that focus pattern, versus the tracking, initially when you half press the shutter, locks on something that it thinks is the subject, and it tries to maintain that particular subject as it moves in the frame. And overall, my experience with both of these is that for birds in flight, varied backgrounds, birds of prey, raptors, all that kind of stuff, the non-tracking mode actually works better, because birds of prey are camouflaged. Their feather patterns can be very, very close to the background. They're very erratic, and basically it's better to just have some degree of control of aiming and trying to find a subject in that focus pattern, as opposed to the camera initially locking on something and then trying to maintain that. Sometimes we'll grab a branch, sometimes we'll grab something in the background, and it'll be unstable. So most of the time I use non-tracking for flight. Sometimes I do use tracking for a specific subjects, and the details of all of these are in my guides. I explain these, what conditions I use for what pattern and what kind of focus I use for what subject. But generally speaking, I prefer to use the non-tracking for birds in flight. And in that sense, they're kind of similar in terms of the non-tracking behavior, although this one has more focus patterns. Now let's talk about the autofocus performance and the differences between the two cameras. Well, before we do that, it's important to realize that the A1 up until now has been the best overall autofocus system for birds in flight across all systems. So trying different things, different cameras in the field, I believe that the A1 overall is the best when it comes to consistency and precision of capturing birds in flight for all kinds of different backgrounds and bird species and all that. And it's pretty close to 100%. It's not 100%, nothing is 100%, but it's pretty high up there, meaning that if the shot is not in focus, it's highly likely that it's either operator error or other factors that are not really related to the autofocus performance of the camera. So how does the A9 III compare to that? So the A9 III, as I mentioned, it has more focus flexibility in terms of how you can configure the focus, in terms of the patterns and all that. The subject recognition in terms of bird eye or bird head recognition between the two, in the field I did not notice any difference. There were cases both of them can easily find the bird and lock on the head and the eye. None of them in those situations had any problems, and there were cases still that both of them don't actually detect the bird and basically focus on the head. These cases include when you're shooting like low close to the water and there are ripples on the water. I found that sometimes the A1 doesn't actually focus on, like, indicate it's focused or it's found the head, and the A9 III was actually similar in those cases. So it wasn't like I saw a significant difference or improvement. So they're both fine. They're both, most of the time they can detect the head and they can basically put the focus on the head. Sometimes both of them can't. If the bird is small, if the bird is far, or if the bird is, in this particular situation, a floating bird with ripples on the water, I find that they both have a little bit of trouble. But that's not a big deal. You can just basically just manually put the focus area on the bird and you'll be done with it. What about actually consistency and the speed of locking and all of those things? I have to say I did not find a quantifiable difference between the two. It is possible that the A9 III might be a little bit better. Again, it's a newer camera, but because the A1 is so good, maybe the difference is so incremental that it doesn't show in the field until maybe you shoot like 1,000,000 images or something like that. But in the period of time that I was using this and I tried different subjects, as I mentioned, I didn't really notice a difference in the speed or consistency. They're both great, and whatever the A9 III can do, in my opinion, the A1 can do too. There's a caveat to that. Of course, the user, the photographer, must use it correctly. They must be skilled and they must know what they're doing. If that's the case, I think you can probably get very similar results in terms of autofocus between the two. They're both great. I can't say this one is better than the other one. It does have more flexibility in terms of how you can configure the focus system, but at the end of the day, shooting the subjects, this one, the A1, can also do it just fine. So I didn't really notice a big difference between these two. So so far it seems like the A9 III makes a number of improvements upon A1. The ergonomics, namely the 120 frames a second, although like I said, it's not needed all the time, or most of the time, and also more flexibility in the focus system. But let's address the main concern, and that is the difference in resolution between these two cameras. The A9 III is 24 megapixels and the A1 is 50 megapixels. That's not just a little bit, it's a significant difference. Now, in order to understand whether that makes a difference in the final processed output for a given subject in photography, we need to discuss it a little bit in more detail. It really depends on what you want to do. If you take a photograph of a scene, a sharp, clean photograph of a scene with 24 megapixels and 50 megapixels, if you blow them up to 100%, as I'll show later, you'll see differences for sure. But if you downsample them to 4K or 2K and sharpen it, there won't be any differences. No one will be able to tell any differences between the two. But in bird photography, we often don't have the luxury of filling the frame with the subject, because the birds are wild and they're far, unless you do some kind of baiting or use a blind or something. They're always far, so cropping is part of the business. And also when you're shooting flight, you're always panning centered. And you don't want in your final image the bird to be dead centered, so you have to crop for composition. And then before you know it, you crop a little bit, you end up with 50% of the original, because you have to crop in both horizontal and vertical directions. So if you crop the image, basically throw out about half of it, for like a flight shot or something like that. With 50 megapixels, you're gonna have 25 megapixels left. That is bigger than the native file that comes out of this guy. So this one you crop 24 megapixels, you throw half away, you end up with 12 megapixels. Now, like a 4K size is about 8 megapixels. So this one will be basically really close to that 8 megapixel after cropping. So you won't have a lot of room to downsample and basically sharpen and things like that. But this one, you're gonna have 25 megapixel left. So you have plenty of room to play with the file, to post-process it, downsample, sharpen, noise reduction, all of those things. And that makes a very big difference. So one of the first things I noticed working with the A9 III is that, because I'm used to A1, I take a photograph and it's perfectly sharp and all that, but when I blow it up on my 32-inch monitor, I just don't see the details that I'm used to. Basically, the file just looks a little bit thin on fine details. And basically the reason for that is I'm used to 50 megapixels. So it's kind of like going back 5 or 6 years, or maybe even longer, when we had the tower like DSLRs like the Canon 1DX series or the Nikon D5, D6. Those are also like about 20 megapixel cameras. And at this point in time, it's really hard to go back, because you will instantly notice the lack of details. And if you do a little bit of cropping, you will see that the file is falling apart pretty fast. Now, if you're using a small laptop screen, or you're just posting on social media, 800 pixels, something like that, then 20 megapixel may still fit the bill. After you crop and process, you may still have enough pixels for those purposes. But if you want to produce 4K files, prints, high quality files, a lot of details, this one is just not going to do it. And the A1 will make a big difference. And you'll see this in the video. I took a test shot of both of these side by side and blow it up, and I'll show you the feather details, the differences between the two. So overall, because we often have to crop our files, and because, you know, as we go newer and newer generations of monitors and screens, they're all going to have higher and higher and higher resolution. They're going to have more and more and more pixels. And basically, in a couple years from now, we're going to have 8K screens, 6K screens, and 20 megapixel will just not be enough at that point. For me, today is not enough, but I think for a majority of people also going forward, it's going to be not enough, for at least for birds, for this kind of subject, because you want to kind of blow up your files a little bit. You want to enjoy viewing them, inspect the close details and all that. And the 20 megapixel in 2024, in my opinion, is just not enough for that. I have a test shot in front of me. The right hand side is taken with the A1, and the left image is taken with the A9 III. I used the 300-2.8 for this test shot on tripod and flex shooter head, f5.6 ISO 250. I chose ISO 250 because that's the lowest ISO for A9 III. And basically we can blow them up and compare the differences. So if I blow them up to 100%, you can right away see that the right hand side is so much larger. And then if you look at the details, the rendition of details, for example here, you can see that these individual feathers are rendered by the A1, but the A9 III, only the tips are visible. The rest here is basically beyond the Nyquist or the resolution of the sensor, so it's not really rendered as separate. And if we just drag this, look around, we see this all over the place. Obviously, like these feathers here, these feathers, the details here, they're rendered here. It's barely even visible. And basically, you can see here again. So there's a significant difference in the amount of detail rendered between the two, in terms of fine details, or these feather details, and it's quite obvious. Now the question is, if you were to basically zoom back and view these at 100%, would you see a difference? Obviously not. If you downsample these images as is, and you look at the post-sharpening file, you probably don't see a difference. But like I mentioned, the main issue for bird photography is you want to crop. So let's say the subject is only like 30% or 40% of the frame, then you will be cropping this area here, and then you will be downsampling that to 4K. And in that case, the 50 megapixel will retain much more detail than the 20 megapixel. And for bird photography, for even for setup shots and perch shots, you often can't frame it perfectly in the finder because the birds move. They move a little bit, so you have to allow room for those movements and do the cropping post capture. And for birds in flight, as I mentioned, you always uh, pan with the bird centered when you're hand holding a large lens like a 600 or 300, and you have to crop for composition. And basically, the 50 megapixel file gives you a lot more latitude in doing so. In terms of sharpness, pixel sharpness between the two, it's obviously using a very sharp piece of optics here. They're similar, so there's no issue in terms of parapixel sharpness. Sometimes cameras have a very strong anti-aliasing filter. A1 obviously doesn't, so it basically parapixel sharpness, both of them are great. This one is rendering 100% of that 24 megapixels, and this one is rendering 100% of the 50 megapixel that it has. So both are perfectly rendering at their limits. It's just that the A1 has a lot more resolution, and then you can see how it resolves these like finer feathers better. Okay, so what is my final verdict on the A9 III versus A1? Which one is better for bird photography, for general bird photography? As we explained, the main advantage of the A9 III is the speed, that continuous shooting speed, and the pre-capture, and a little bit more flexibility in the autofocus system. I would say overall, in terms of autofocus performance, I wouldn't pick this over the A1. Maybe it is a little bit better. I wasn't able to discern that difference. So for me, they're a wash. In terms of speed, 120 frames a second, it's useful in some particular situations, not in all conditions. In fact, not most of the time is not going to really get you anything more because it's just overkill. But in some certain situations, it will make a difference. It will allow you to get some maybe amazing shots. But those situations, those particular cases are very specialized, like setup, like I mentioned, like kingfisher diving, and you want to basically capture the exact moment where the beak is hitting the water, stuff like that. You can do it with this easier because it's 120 frames a second. Than you can do with the A1. The A1 you have to maybe try like 4 or 5 times. This one will get it the first time. But those are very specific conditions, and you don't choose like a general purpose camera, a general camera for very, very specific conditions. That's a specialized tool. Shooting with this, my main problem is that the resolution is just not there. The files are too small, and I've been using the A1 now for 4 years, something like that, 3-4 years, since when it came out. I'm just used to being able to see a lot of details in my files on my large screen, be able to crop the images, and I can't do it with this. Good examples, I shot some white-tailed kites, and these are very skittish birds here in the West Coast. You can't really get close to them, so I use 1200 millimeters, the 600 with the 2x, to basically get anything decent from them. And even so, with this one, I literally had like 1 or 2 files where there are 2 birds in the frame, so I can crop a little bit wider and get away with it. The rest of them, they don't make it. They're just not enough pixels. But with this one, I can always, at 1200 millimeters, most of the time, 90% of the time, I can get something out of the kites because there's just a lot of focal length and a lot of resolution. So in the past, I remember maybe in 2010 time frame, 2012, when I had Canon, there was always this dilemma between high resolution and slow, and low resolution and fast. And back then the thing was that the 1DX series or the 1D series, it was always low on megapixels, but it was not only faster, much faster than the something like the 5D series. The autofocus was so much better that basically for birds in flight, the high resolution camera was literally not even usable. So there wasn't this comparison, the case for this comparison at all. The other one just couldn't do it. Doesn't matter how many megapixels it has. Then with Nikon, it changed a little bit. This is the time when I had D850 and D5. The D850 and D5 had essentially the same autofocus system. Maybe the D5 was a tiny bit faster or what, but the D850 was slow. I believe it was 7 frames or 9 frames, I don't remember exactly, versus the D5, but it was 45 megapixel versus 20 megapixel. And when I go back to my files from those years and I look at how many files I had with the D850 versus D5, the majority of my files are actually with the D850, because it was the first time the high resolution camera actually had good autofocus. And it was not, I wouldn't say it was fast enough to my liking, but it was kind of okay. But even so, because I was able to basically crop and get more details, I ended up with more files from that. And now fast forwarding to today, we don't have that dilemma anymore. We don't have to choose between slow and high resolution and fast and low resolution. We have to choose between fast and high resolution, like super fast and high resolution, and insanely fast and low resolution, like stupid fast and low resolution. And for me, I don't really need that stupid fast for all of the most of the species that I photograph. So my pick would be for bird photography, still the A1 will be my camera of choice for birds in flight, for general bird photography. For cases, situations where I would think that I need 120 frames a second, I would probably rent this or borrow this and use it for those cases. But when I go out, I'm still going to take my A1, and that remains the best camera for me. For my style of shooting and for what I expect from my files. Again, I have a large monitor. I want to blow up my files and look at details, and I don't really produce any files smaller than 4K size anymore. So that's another factor that may or may not be the case for you. So this is my overall take, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Going forward, I hope some of the improvements in A9 III will make it to the next version of A1, A1 II. I really don't need the 120 frames a second. I would say maybe something like 40 frames a second would be ideal, but even 30 frames a second is good enough. The improvements that I would really want to see is that the finder even getting larger, higher resolution, and no speed drop at 240 hertz. Improve that, and basically ergonomic improvements, a little bit heavier, not heavier, but chunkier grip, and better rear screen, and basically all the flexibility and improvements in autofocus, they're always welcome. So it's going to be more about flexibility going forward, as opposed to, you know, significantly improving the performance, because the performance is already incredibly good compared to what we had, you know, in the DSLR days. So I wouldn't really honestly expect any miracles there, but any incremental improvements also will come. But I would still want to see same or higher resolution. Same resolution is good, maybe a little higher is even better, but I wouldn't want to go back to shooting with 20 megapixel camera anymore. It just doesn't work for me. So that's basically my take, and I hope you enjoyed this. I'm gonna write some of this up on the blog, you can read it, and I'm gonna also put the images that we talked about the test shot between the two on the blog. You can take a look. Thank you.